Now we got this template here. And we got this view, of course, that renders this template. But one thing is missing. We haven't added a URL for this view yet. And we need to do that. Otherwise, there is no way of reaching that view function, of invoking this view function. And therefore, we need to go to URLs py. And here, I want to register a second path. And that's the URLs py file of this app. So in the meetups folder, that's this URLs py file. Now, the path here is generally up to you. You can, of course, use any path segments of your choice here, but actually here I want to have meetups slash and then some dynamic path segment. To be precise, I'd like to have a unique identifier in the URL here, so that we actually do load this page by visiting ourdomain.com/meetups, but then slash and then something like a first meetup or a second meetup. So the same template, the same page is loaded for different URLs. And this dynamic segment, of course, then should be used in the view later to retrieve the right data for the selected meetup from the database. So we encode the identifier of the to-be-loaded meetup in the URL. That's the idea here. So this should be dynamic, a dynamic path segment. And that's, of course, a super common feature which is supported by Django. And the syntax for defining such a dynamic segment, where you as a developer don't know the exact value in advance, is that you use angle brackets here. You use angle brackets in your path definition. And between those angle brackets, you can use any identifier of your choice. For example, meetup ID, or in my case, meetup slug, because I want this slug identifier, which I mentioned earlier. In the index view, I added such a slug to my dummy data, and I explained that this is basically like an ID. It's a unique identifier per item, but it's more search engine friendly because it is human readable. So that is what I want to encode in my URL, and I'll name it meetup slug therefore. And Django actually even allows us to enforce that only such a value is added here and parse that correctly then by adding a so-called converter here. And there is a slug converter which we can add like this, slug colon, and then our identifier, which is up to you. Slug here is not up to you. And what this does is it tells Django that the dynamic value which we'll have here in our path should match this slug format. So it should look something like this, all lowercase with dashes between the words and so on. And it will be treated as such by Django internally. We don't have to add this, but we can add it for even better support of this slug feature here as an identifier in the URL. But now with that we defined this path, now we still need to point at the right view, and that's what I'll do here with views dot and then meetup details to load the meetup details view if we enter this path. Now we don't need to change anything in our main URLs py file because we already do load all the meetups URLs here, and that simply was one additional URL which we did now add there. So if we now save this, we should be able to visit this page by entering /meetups/ a first dash meetup here in the URL, and I get an error. Meetup details got an unexpected keyword argument meetup slug. Now it's not a 404 error, so we did correctly find that view, but Django basically encountered a problem when it tried to execute that view function. And the reason for that is that since we do have such a dynamic segment in our path for this meetup details view, We also need to manipulate this meetup details view function a little bit. And to be precise, we need to add a keyword argument for this dynamic segment. We need to match this identifier which we chose here, meetup_slug in my case, with a parameter of the same name in this view function. Because Django will automatically pass the concrete value for this dynamic placeholder when this page is visited into this view function, and it will pass that value into this function through that parameter. So if I would print meetup slug here in this view function, now that we accept this parameter, if we save everything, if we reload this page, you see I get an error regarding the template not existing. We'll fix this in a second, but we don't get that error from before anymore. And here in the terminal where I started my development server, if I scroll above this error which I got, you see here I get the output from this print statement. So that's working. Now it's not finding my template here as it seems. Meetup detail, because I named my file meetup details with an S at the end. So that should be meetup details HTML. But if we fix that, now we should be able to reload this and load this meetup detail page. And the styling should also be there. If it's not, open the DevTools and try a hard reload here. So that's now our second template loaded here. But we now got some new problems or missing features which we need to tackle. For example, I only got there by manually entering this URL. And I would rather click a button here. But for that, we need to construct this URL dynamically here, and it turns out that we have more than one way of doing that. In addition, if we have a look at our templates, meetup details and index.html, we have some code duplication. The base skeleton, for example, is basically the same. There is reused HTML code. The header is the same. And hence, we might want to kind of share code across templates so that we don't have this unnecessary duplication. Because whilst it is definitely fine with 2 HTML files, if you think of a bigger project, potentially with dozens or maybe even hundreds of HTML files, then having this duplication would be quite problematic. If you ever want to change your header, you have to make that change in hundreds of files. Not very convenient. And therefore, adding such a link with different approaches and their benefits and disadvantages, as well as sharing code, that's what we'll dive in next.